I now give the floor to His Excellency Fayssal Mekdad, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Your Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, President of the 76th Session of the United Nations General Assembly. I would like at the outset to congratulate you for your election as President of the current session of the General Assembly, and I wish you all success in discharging your duties. I would like also to thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for the efforts he is making within the framework of his mandate to achieve the aspirations of member states in accordance with the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, over the past 2 years, the world has experienced unprecedented circumstances where hospitals reached full capacity, millions of lives were lost, economies contracted, poverty and hunger soared, cities were into lockdown, curfews were imposed, universities and schools closed their doors, and we grew afraid of approaching one another. All of this because of an invisible virus that continues to evolve and mutate, threatening to claim more lives from all over the world. In the midst of such difficult times, there was a glimmer of hope, as extraordinary efforts were made and medical breakthroughs were achieved, as well as gestures of human solidarity from a number of nations. However, there was a dark side, as some used the pandemic as a way to settle political scores and accuse other countries of creating the virus, while others selfishly ignored the needs of others, choosing to believe they were alone on this earth. Even worse, there are those who took advantage of the pandemic to scale up their unilateral coercive economic measures against those countries and people who differ with them, despite the catastrophic humanitarian impact of such measures. They lent deaf ears to the repeated appeals of the United Nations and humanitarian agencies, calling for waiving those measures or reducing the same. If COVID-19 would claim one life in the absence of so-called sanctions, it would claim so many more when they are in place. As the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights said, and I quote, "Sanctions are bringing suffering and death to countries like Cuba, Iran, the Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen," unquote. And as noted by a group of independent UN human rights experts, I quote, "Sanctions that were imposed in the name of delivering human rights are in fact killing people and depriving them of fundamental rights, including the right to health, to food, and to life itself." End of quote. We welcome the theme of the 76th session of the General Assembly, namely, building resilience through hope. Nevertheless, I wonder, will everyone heed the call? Will they rebuild sustainably and respect the rights of people? Will they learn the lessons of the past? Will certain governments abandon their flawed policies that have jeopardized international security and stability? These questions seek clear and decisive answers if the theme of this general debate is not to remain a mere slogan for media and political consumption without any impact in the real world. Mr. President, you are well aware that Syria was one of the countries most affected by terrorism and terrorist crimes, which have been conducted thanks to military, financial, media, and logistic support from countries known for sponsoring terrorism. And we have sustained a lot of tragedies as terrorists have killed and displaced innocent people, destroyed infrastructure, looted Syria's resources, and created a humanitarian crisis in a country that had so much to be proud of, having achieved a development level of more than 9.5% annually before the start of the terrorist war against Syria. However, and thanks to the sacrifices of our people and armed forces, and with the valuable support of our allies and friends, we have made significant advances in combating and eradicating terrorism. It will go in the annals of history that Syrians have defended not only themselves and their country, but the whole world against terrorism. Syria confirms that it will continue this noble fight until we root out all terrorists from our land and restore state authority and restore security and stability. This is our national and constitutional obligation and a non-negotiable right. We will not succumb regardless of external pressure and no matter the lies and accusations made against us. For those that continue to support and invest in terrorists, we would like to tell them that they will be doomed to fail. Sooner or later, the support of terrorism will come back to haunt them, and innocent people will end up paying the price, exactly as is the case in a number of countries. Thus, we all have to be keen on averting this tragedy. In this regard, it seems that one of those who spoke on this rostrum a few days ago is still totally detached from reality, and they have the illusion that they could turn back the clock and that their money can cover their failures and crimes, or that their continued investment in terrorism in Syria can achieve the goals of their masters. Mr. President, Syria has seriously and positively engaged in the Astana process, hoping it would contribute to the fight against terrorism and to the country's security and stability. However, the Turkish regime has shown time and again that it's not committed to the outcomes of the Astana process nor the Sochi understandings on Idlib in the northwest of Syria. Instead, it continues to support and protect terrorist groups operating in that region, especially Al-Nusra Front, designated by the Security Council as a terrorist entity. Thus, the region has become an incubator for foreign terrorists, as confirmed by the reports of relevant Security Council committees. In addition to the fact that the Turkish regime has perpetrated and continues to perpetrate war crimes and crimes against humanity in the territories of Syria that it occupies, either by way of Turkification and policies of forced demographic change and displacement, or by way of collective punishment by deliberately and repeatedly cutting off the water supply of more than 1 million Syrians in Hasaka and the surrounding towns. On top of that, the Turkish regime has reduced the water level on the Euphrates to less than half the levels agreed between both countries in 1987, which emanated into dangerous humanitarian repercussions in addition to the ecological, health, and agricultural consequences. All these violations and crimes require urgent and serious action by the Security Council and the Secretariat to bring them to an immediate end. Mr. President, we reiterate that any foreign presence on Syrian soil without the consent of the Syrian government is illegal and constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and the United Nations Charter, as well as all relevant Security Council resolutions, which reaffirm yet again the importance of upholding Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. Such presence, Mr. President, hinders counter-terrorism efforts and threatens regional stability and security. Thus, Turkish and US forces, which continue to occupy Syrian territories under false pretexts and they're looting the natural resources of the Syrian people, should end immediately without any preconditions. Just as we managed to wipe out terrorists from the majority of Syrian territories, we will work to end the occupation with the same resolve and determination, using all possible means under international law. History shows that Syria always drives out occupiers sooner or later. As for the few seeking secession in northeast Syria, we warn them against harboring such illusions that contradict the will of the Syrian people. By pursuing such ends, they are allying themselves with those plotting against Syria's unity, and they will be dealt with accordingly. They must abandon their delusions and wake up and learn from recent lessons. Favoring external and occupying forces over their own people is doomed to fail and will only bring them humiliation and will harm their country and people. If they still consider themselves part of the Syrian people. Mr. President, in tandem with fighting terrorism, the Syrian government have always been open to any and all genuine and impartial political initiatives aiming to help us overcome this crisis that inflicted the Syrian people and state, despite the obstacles placed by those countries that have no interest whatsoever in Syria's stability. While unwavering in our commitment to our national principles, the Syrian government has participated in the Geneva talks, the Moscow consultations, and the Astana meetings. We have also facilitated the convening of the Constitutional Committee by helping reach an agreement on its composition and rules of procedure. In this regard, we reiterate that this process must be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned with no external interference whatsoever. The constitution and all related issues fall within the exclusive right of Syrians and must be decided by them exclusively. We also stress the importance that the Special Envoy for Syria must focus on his role as a facilitator and report on the proceedings in an honest, unbiased, and objective manner. Mr. President, we have recurrently reiterated that Syria's doors are widely open for the safe and voluntary return of all refugees to their home country, homeland. All relevant institutions in Syria are tirelessly working towards that goal by rebuilding and rehabilitating infrastructure and services in areas reclaimed from terrorists and by putting the necessary procedures in place to facilitate the return of people and meet their basic needs. Towards this end, a number of decrees have been issued which could contribute to the safe and voluntary return of our people. Unfortunately, while the Syrian government and its allies are making honest efforts on this humanitarian issue, some continue to take advantage of the sufferings of Syrians to serve an agenda that has nothing to do with humanitarian objectives or the interests of Syrians. In this regard, we do stress the importance that humanitarian action in Syria must fully respect Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and to be conducted in coordination with the Syrian government and with their consent in line with the General Assembly Resolution 46/182. We also call for expanding the scope of humanitarian interventions to incorporate development assistance and early recovery and resilience projects which would provide water, sanitation, health, medical, and housing services. We stand ready to do our utmost to ensure humanitarian access to beneficiaries in Syria. The so-called cross-border aid mechanism must be shut down following incidents of corruption and failures. And I repeat, corruption and failures, especially the diversion of aid to terrorist groups instead of the people who actually need the same. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the Syrian Arab Republic stresses once again that the use of chemical weapons is reprehensible and completely unacceptable under any circumstances by anyone, anywhere, and any time. This is the Syrian position. This is why Syria has voluntarily acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention and has fulfilled all relevant obligations in record time while maintaining cooperation, taking into consideration that certain countries continue to maintain those weapons since World War II. And some of those countries are present in this very hall at this very moment. Syria continues to cooperate with the OPCW to settle the matter as soon as possible. Unfortunately, certain countries have sought to explicitly politicize this issue. They have made baseless and groundless accusations against Syria, relying on information from terrorists and their supporters, and don't act surprised. They are also relying on totally incredible reports because they only use the internet and open sources, and you are very well aware of who are publishing this information on internet. They have also misconstrued the provisions of the CWC to create illegal mechanisms and pushed through a decision imposed by Western countries against Syria at the 25th session of the Conference of State Parties to the CWC. And this decision constitutes a dangerous precedent for the organization and a threat to all state parties. It's a specter over the heads of all state parties. Mr. President, Israel since 1967 continues to occupy a dear part of Syrian territories, which is the Golan Heights. Therefore, the Syrian Arab Republic remains firmly committed to exercising its right to fully recover the occupied Syrian Golan up to the line of 4th of June 1967. All decisions and measures taken by Israel, the occupying power, to alter the region's natural and demographic features and impose Israeli laws and administration are null and void and have no legal effect under international law and relevant UN resolutions, notably Security Council Resolution 497 of 1981. It is totally unacceptable for the United Nations and the international community to continue to fail to enjoin on Israel to implement those resolutions and to cease its systematic and grave violations of international humanitarian and human rights laws. All the while, Israel continues to expand its settlements and support terrorists. It persecutes, discriminates against, and arbitrarily detains Syrians under its occupation, and it plunders the Golan's natural resources and repeatedly violates Syria's sovereignty. Thus, Israel must be held accountable for this rogue behavior and ensure its impunity, and ensure that it will not enjoy impunity. This is important for regional security and stability and for the sake of justice and international law. Despite what we have been through over the past few years in Syria, the Palestinian cause continues to be a central priority for Syria. Syria, which has spared no effort in supporting our brotherly Palestinian people in their struggle to reclaim the occupied territories and regain all their legitimate rights, especially the right to establish their independent state on their territory with Jerusalem as its capital, and the right of full-fledged membership to the United Nations, together with the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homeland in line with the international law and the relevant UN resolutions. We also call for putting an end to Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially killings, settlement activities, siege tactics, arbitrary detention, forced displacement, racial discrimination. Syria holds countries supporting Israel the responsibility for the implications of those crimes and the persistence thereof. Mr. President, Syria expresses its full support of and solidarity with the Islamic Republic of Iran in the face of the illegal and irresponsible U.S. measures against it, especially following the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. In this regard, Syria condemns the economic embargo imposed on Cuba for decades now, and the American militarization of the situation in the Korean Peninsula. My country also calls for putting an end to the economic terrorism imposed by the United States and its Western allies against Venezuela, Iran, Belarus, Nicaragua, and the DPRK, as well as my country, Syria, in accordance with the international law and UN resolutions. In this regard, I must also support Russia and China's efforts to uphold international law, maintain security and stability, and promote development worldwide in the face of the hegemonic policies and interference attempts of certain countries. Mr. President, in conclusion, we have to promote dialogue and understanding between one another based on mutual respect, common interests, sovereign equality, and respect of the international law. This is necessary if we are to build a new, more balanced, democratic, and just world order that contributes to achieving the common aspirations of our people and the development, prosperity, and stability that we aspire to. This must be done in detachment from the political interference by certain governments and their support of terrorism and unilateral coercive measures in contravention of all the values espoused by humanity and the principles of the Charter. Some need to understand that we live in the same interconnected world, and that no country can serve its interests and ensure its security at the expense of the interests and security of other countries. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement.